The pit trap had been dug for wolves, and it caught, instead, the emperor of 9 provinces. It was an old trap, one of dozens scattered through the deep forest by poachers working the border where the crown's hunting laws thinned out into something more like suggestion, staked with sharpened thornwood barbs meant to hold a wolf's leg fast until the trapper returned to collect his prize. No poacher setting those barbs had ever imagined they might one day catch something considerably larger, flying low through the canopy on an ordinary evening survey of the border's deep timber, misjudging a landing in failing light, and driving one forepaw down directly onto 3 barbs angled precisely to tear worse the more a trapped creature struggled. Aurelian struggled exactly once, instinctively, before the pain taught him the trap's particular cruelty. The barbs were not merely sharp, they were structured, hooked in 3s at angles that meant no single motion could free even one, without driving the other 2 deeper. He stood in the deep forest at dusk, one forepaw pinned by 3 thornwood barbs, and understood, with the flat clarity of a creature assessing a genuine crisis, that this was not an injury he could simply fly through or wait out. He was, by every practical measure of his rule, 3 days' hard flight from any physician he trusted with a wound this politically inconvenient to explain. An emperor caught in a poacher's trap, unable to free himself, was precisely the kind of vulnerability his council's more ambitious factions would spend years turning into a story about weakness rather than misfortune. So Aurelian did the only thing pride and calculation both agreed on. He stayed in the deep forest, hidden in the densest cover the pinned leg could still drag him toward, and told no one. The forest, it turned out, already had someone in it who understood exactly what a fresh trap in the deep timber meant, and who found him before the first night was through. Nell Corrigan knew the deep forest the way most people knew their own kitchen. Every deadfall, every game trail, every one of her father's trap lines, because she had walked it at his side since she was old enough to carry a knife, and had walked it alone, out of grim necessity, since the season 2 winters back, when his traps had stopped feeding 2 mouths, and she had taken over the lines herself, rather than watch them both go hungry. She found the fresh disturbance near the old wolf pit at first light, drawn by an unfamiliar broken pattern in the frost-crusted bracken that her trained eye read as wrong before her mind had fully caught up to why, and she came around the last stand of pine to find, in the pit's shallow rim, a creature considerably larger than any wolf her father's traps had ever been built to hold. Any sensible trapper's daughter backs away from a wounded dragon 3 times her own reasonable size. Nell had spent 2 winters alone learning that sensible and survivable were not always the same instruction, and something in the animal's stillness, pained but not thrashing, watchful but not aggressive, the particular quality of a creature that has already calculated it, cannot win a fight, and has chosen conservation over panic. Read to her the same way an injured wolf in one of her own traps read, dangerous, yes, but reachable, if you moved the way the danger required, rather than the way fear wanted. That is a bad trap, she said, crouching at a careful distance, studying the pinned paw with the flat professional assessment of someone who had freed 100 animals from 100 traps and understood, before she ever touched it, exactly how this particular cruelty worked. Thornwood barbs, 3 of them by the look of the blood pattern, set to tear if you pull against more than one. Whoever staked this line was not hunting wolves kindly. The great head turned toward her, exhausted and wary in equal measure, and Nell, reading the wariness correctly as a creature deciding whether she was threat or help, did the only thing that seemed likely to answer the question honestly. She reached, slowly, toward the first and shallowest of the 3 barbs, and waited to see whether the paw would let her. I want to tell you, before the second visit, exactly what had made Nell Corrigan the one person in 3 days' flight of that trap capable of freeing it properly, because it was not luck that put her at the pit's edge that morning. Her father had run these lines for 30 years before his hands gave out to the particular ruin that decades of cold-weather trapping does to joints, and Nell had inherited not merely the trap lines themselves, but the whole hard-won vocabulary of freeing trapped things without making the injury worse. A vocabulary the border patrols, competent as they were at their actual job, had never needed to learn, because soldiers dealt in threats to be neutralized, not in wounds to be patiently unmade. She had freed foxes with legs nearly severed by careless wire. She had freed, once, a bear cub whose mother had abandoned the pit rather than risk the trapper's return, and had spent 4 increasingly dangerous hours doing it, because a half-freed animal in pain is more dangerous than a fully trapped one, and Nell had learned, the hard way, exactly how much patience that math actually required. The first barb, examined properly, confirmed what she'd suspected from the blood pattern. It could come free cleanly, on its own, without disturbing the other two, if drawn along the precise curve its hook demanded, rather than pulled straight. She talked while she worked, the way she always did with frightened, trapped things, a low, running commentary that was as much for her own steady hands as for whatever comfort it offered the animal. "This one first," she said, "because it is shallowest, and because your weight has shifted onto it least, which means it will hurt you least to lose. The other two want more patience than I have light left for today. I will need to come back." The first barb came free clean, exactly as she'd read it, and the great paw flexed once, testing the relief, and the enormous eye that had watched her work the whole time held an attention that told her, plainer than words could have, that the creature had understood every word of the plan. She came back the next evening, as promised, and found him waiting in the same clearing, not trapped any longer in the literal sense, since the first barb's removal had freed enough motion that he could have fled deep into territory she'd never have found him in. He had not fled. He had simply moved to more defensible cover and waited, through a full day and night, for a trapper's daughter to return and finish what she'd started. That alone told Nell something worth noting, though she did not yet have the full context to understand whatever this creature was, it had chosen, deliberately, to trust a stranger's word over its own considerable capacity to simply disappear. The second barb was deeper, angled worse, and required a longer, more careful working loose that cost them both the better part of an hour. Nell's hands steady through it, with the same patient economy she'd have given any of her father's old trap lines, the dragon holding stiller than she had any right to expect from something in that much pain, as though it had decided, somewhere in the previous night's long wait, that stillness was the one gift it could offer back in exchange for her return. "You held very still for that," she said afterward, examining her work, satisfied. "Most things I free do not manage that, even the ones with more sense than fear. That is a rarer trait than you might think." The great head lowered, briefly, in a gesture she read correctly as something like acknowledgement, and Nell, packing away her tools in the fading light, found herself already turning over the third visit in her mind, not as an obligation, but as an appointment she was looking forward to keeping, which surprised her rather more than the dragon's stillness had. Let me tell you what those 2 visits had actually cost Aurelian, because the paw's healing was the least of it. He had spent 14 years learning, through the specific hard education that rule provides, exactly how rarely trust survives contact with its own risk. Every advisor who had ever sworn loyalty had, eventually, weighed that loyalty against some competing interest. Every physician who had ever treated him had done so within the careful architecture of court protocol, gloves and ceremony, and the particular formal distance that made the touching of an emperor a transaction rather than a kindness. He could not, in 14 years, recall a single instance of a stranger extending patient, unhurried care toward him, with no evident awareness of what that care might be worth to leverage later. Nell did not know what he was. That fact alone made her care different in kind, not merely in degree, from anything the court had ever offered him. She was not managing an emperor's wound. She was freeing a trapped animal, exactly as she would have freed any of the 100 creatures before him, with the same unhurried patience and the same complete absence of calculation. He found himself, across those first 2 visits, doing something he had not done in longer than he cared to examine, waiting for a person to return, not out of political necessity, but simply because her return was the thing he wanted most in a day otherwise defined entirely by pain and hiding. It was, he would think much later, an unsettlingly simple realization for a man who had spent 14 years mastering considerably more complicated ones. The third barb, deepest and worst angled of the 3, would require the most trust yet, Trust enough to let her work at the paw's most sensitive point, close enough that a single wrong flinch from either of them could cost her fingers, rather than merely his comfort. He found, turning the coming visit over through a second long night of waiting, that he trusted her with it entirely, and had no clear account of when, exactly, that trust had finished building itself. The third visit took the whole of a short winter afternoon, because the deepest barb had lodged nearest the paw's central nerve cluster, and Nell would not be rushed into a mistake that could cost the animal the use of the limb entirely. She talked him through every stage of it, the way she always did, though this time the commentary carried a different weight, both of them aware without saying so that this extraction mattered more than the previous two combined. "This is the one that will hurt worst," she told him plainly, because she had learned, freeing frightened things for 2 winters, that honesty served the work better than false comfort. "I cannot make it not hurt. I can only promise I will not rush it, and that rushing it would hurt you considerably more than the truth does." The great paw, offered up to her with a trust that would have seemed impossible 3 days earlier, did not flinch even when the working loose reached its worst moment, the barb's hook catching and requiring a delicate half-turn Nell executed with the exact unhurried precision her father had drilled into her across a decade of harder extractions than this one. It came free clean. The paw, whole for the first time in 3 days, flexed fully, and the sound the dragon made, low, rumbling, unmistakably relief rather than pain, settled something in Nell's chest that she did not examine too closely at the time. "There," she said, packing away tools stained with 3 days' worth of careful work. "That is the last of them. You should heal clean, if you keep the weight off it a week or so, which I recognize is easier instruction to give a person than a creature your size, but I will offer it anyway, since offering good advice, regardless of whether it gets followed, is rather the family trade." The great eye, clear now of the pain-dulled wariness of the first visit, held her with an attention that had become, over 3 days, something considerably warmer than simple assessment. The healing, once the barbs were out, proceeded faster than even Nell's considerable experience had led her to expect, a week's careful rest rendering the paw fully sound, no lingering favor in the gait, no sign at all beyond 3 faint pale scars where the thornwood had done its worst. She had continued visiting through that week regardless of the wound's rapid mending, telling herself, with the particular self-deception of someone unwilling yet to examine why, that she was simply confirming the healing held. The truth, when she finally admitted it to herself on the 5th evening, walking home through the darkening timber with her father's old lantern swinging at her side, was considerably simpler and considerably more disruptive to the orderly, solitary life she had built across 2 hard winters. She had begun, somewhere in 3 days of careful extraction, to look forward to the walk out to that clearing more than she looked forward to almost anything else in her narrow, trapline-bound days. The dragon, for its part, had made no move to leave the deep forest once the paw was fully healed, which struck Nell as strange, given that nothing beyond her own company now bound it to that particular stretch of timber. She did not yet know enough to understand what she was actually witnessing, an emperor who had found, in 3 days of a trapper's daughter's patient, unagended care, the first entirely unweighted presence of his 14-year reign, and who was, in the manner of creatures unused to wanting things without immediately calculating the cost, taking his time working out what to do with the wanting. It happened on an evening a fortnight after the 3rd thorn came free, when an early winter storm caught Nell 3 miles from her cabin, with dusk coming on fast, and the temperature dropping toward the kind of cold that killed careless trappers every hard season. She had been checking the farthest of her father's old lines, later than sense recommended, and the storm's speed had caught her badly positioned, and she was calculating, with the flat practical fear of someone who had buried enough neighbors to hard winters to take the math seriously, exactly how survivable 3 miles of open exposure in this weather actually was, when the great shape she had come to recognize by silhouette alone dropped out of the whirling snow and landed directly in her path. It lowered itself, deliberately, unmistakably, until its back sat low enough for a person to reasonably climb, and Nell, who had spent 2 winters learning to read animal intention the way other people read faces, understood the offer for exactly what it was. "You are offering to carry me," she said, half question, half disbelieving statement, snow already thick in her hair. "I have spent 2 winters walking these lines on my own 2 feet, and I confess I am not entirely certain how one climbs a dragon with any dignity intact." The great head turned back toward her, patient, unmoving, the offer plainly not going anywhere until she accepted it, and Nell Corrigan, cold and 3 miles from home with a storm closing fast, decided that dignity was a luxury she could reasonably set aside in favor of survival. She climbed. It flew her home in a fraction of the time the walk would have taken, low and careful through the worst of the wind, and set her down at her own cabin door with a gentleness that undid something in her chest she had been carefully not examining for a fortnight. It became, after that first storm-caught evening, simply how the rest of the winter went. Nell walked her lines by day, as she always had, and more evenings than not, the dragon met her somewhere along the route home, lowering its back without ceremony, and carried her the last stretch through weather that would otherwise have cost her hours of hard, cold walking. She learned things about winter on a dragon's back that no one in the deep forest could have told her, because no one in the deep forest had ever had occasion to learn them. The particular deep warmth radiating up through the scales even in the coldest air, the way the great wings could be angled to break the worst of a crosswind before it ever reached her, the specific quality of watching her own familiar traplines unspool beneath her from a height she had never once expected to see them from. "You did not have to keep doing this," she told him, one particularly clear evening, watching her breath fog in air made bearable only by the warmth beneath her. "I have managed 2 winters of these lines entirely on my own. I am not incapable of a third." "I am aware you are not incapable," the dragon did not say, because it could not, in that form, but the great head turned back toward her with an expression she had learned, over weeks of evenings, to read as plainly as speech. Capability was never the question. The question was why a creature that had spent 14 years surrounded by people managing him had chosen, the very first moment its own healing allowed, to spend every free evening instead simply carrying her home. She began, somewhere in the deep middle of that winter, to suspect the answer, and to find that she did not mind it nearly as much as 2 winters of careful solitude might once have predicted. There is one more piece of that winter worth telling. From a night roughly midway between the third thorn and the storm-caught evening, because it explains something about the quiet, unspoken shift that had already been happening long before either of them named it aloud. Nell's father, ill by then in the way of men whose bodies finally collect the whole bill for decades of hard winter work, had taken a bad turn on a night when the deep forest's paths were too dangerous for a lone woman to walk to the nearest healer 3 valleys distant. She had gone anyway, because the alternative was watching him worsen through a night she might have shortened, and she had barely reached the clearing's edge, torch in hand, weighing the genuine danger of the route against the genuine danger of waiting, when the dragon found her. It read the situation before she'd said a single word. Her face, the torch, the direction she was determined to walk despite every sound reason not to, and lowered its back without her even having to ask, the offer arriving before the request could form. She climbed without hesitation this time, all pretense of managing alone burned away by the plainer urgency of her father's fever, and the flight to the healer's door took a fraction of the hours the walk would have cost her, low and fast through timber she would never have dared navigate on foot in the dark. The healer came. Her father, though it was a near thing for 2 more days, recovered. And Nell, sitting vigil at his bedside through the worst of that fever, found herself thinking less about the crisis itself than about the plain fact that a wild creature she had known only 3 weeks had read her fear correctly, from a distance, before she'd asked for anything, and had simply provided the one thing that mattered, without requiring her to explain why. "You saved him," she told the dragon, days later, once the fever had broken and her father was mending, finding the great shape waiting at the clearing's edge, the way it always did now. "Or you saved the time it would have taken me to reach help on foot, which amounts to the same thing. I do not know how to properly thank a creature for that. My whole life's vocabulary of thanks is built around scraps and small kindnesses, and this was considerably larger than either." The great head lowered, gently, until it rested near her own, And Nell understood, without needing further explanation, that whatever thanks she felt obligated to offer had already been more than repaid by the simple fact of her father's continued breathing. That this creature, whoever, or whatever it truly was beneath the scales, measured its own kindnesses by an entirely different accounting than the one she'd grown up with, one where the giving itself was the whole of the transaction, and no further repayment was ever expected or required. It was, though she would not fully understand this until the clearing revealed his true face weeks later, the moment Nell Corrigan stopped merely appreciating the dragon's company and started, quietly and without quite admitting it to herself, to need it. The shift happened on the last hard freeze of that winter, on an evening when Nell, climbing up onto the familiar warm back for what had become an unremarkable, comfortable routine, found herself set down not at her own cabin door, but in an unfamiliar clearing she had never once, in a lifetime of walking this forest, come across. The dragon lowered itself once she'd climbed free, and the air bent the way it does, and where 3 days of careful trust and a whole winter's worth of evening flights had lived inside 40 feet of scale, there stood instead a man she recognized, with a jolt that went through her entire body, from the coin she'd spent that very morning at the trading post, 3 valleys over. "You are the Emperor," Nell said, the pieces arranging themselves with the same swift, competent clarity she brought to reading a trapline. "I have spent a winter freeing the Emperor of 9 provinces from a poacher's trap, and riding home on his back 3 evenings out of 5. "You have spent a winter," Aurelian corrected gently, "doing precisely what you would have done for any trapped creature in that forest, with no evident awareness that the creature in question happened also to hold a throne. I would ask you not to let the throne diminish what the winter actually was, Nell Corrigan, which was the first entirely unweighted kindness I have received in 14 years of rule." She was quiet a long moment, taking in the whole shape of what a winter's ordinary evenings had actually been. "I did not free you because of what you were," she said finally. "I would have freed a fox from that trap with the same patience. I would have carried anyone home through that storm, had I the means to." "I know," Aurelian said, and something in his voice carried the particular quiet wonder of a man still working out the full shape of what a winter had actually given him. "That is precisely why it mattered as much as it did. Khalil Gibran wrote that out of suffering have emerged the strongest souls. I have always understood that to mean the suffering itself forges strength, and I do not entirely disagree. But I have come to believe, this winter, that it forges something else as well, the capacity to recognize, in someone else's patient hands, the exact quality of care that suffering teaches you to value, above every gilded, calculated kindness a throne can otherwise provide. You freed 3 thorns from my paw one at a time, at your own pace, on your own honest terms, and asked nothing of me in return, beyond the courtesy of holding still. I have spent 14 years being given everything except that particular courtesy." They married at the Pit Trap's old clearing, the following autumn, at Nell's own quiet insistence. The site cleared of its cruel staking by then, and planted instead with the hardy mountain flowers she'd always meant to grow there. A garden built directly over the place where 3 days of patient extraction had first taught an emperor what unweighted trust actually felt like. She kept her father's traplines, by her own choice, though the palace physicians eventually convinced her to teach her particular vocabulary of patient freeing to the imperial menagerie's own keepers, who had, it turned out, considerably more to learn from a trapper's daughter than any court text had ever managed to record. The 3 pale scars on Aurelian's paw never fully faded, and he kept them, deliberately, unhealed past the point vanity might otherwise have demanded, because Nell traced them sometimes in the quiet hours, a throne still occasionally allowed them, and told him, every time, the same plain truth. That a wound patiently tended leaves a different kind of mark than one merely closed over, and that she had rather he carried the visible proof of 3 days' trust than a smooth, unmarked paw that remembered nothing of how it had healed. Every court physician who has examined that paw since has offered to finish the healing properly, Aurelian told her once, turning his own forepaw over in the firelight to study the 3 faint lines himself. "Erase the scarring entirely, if I wished it. I have refused every single time, and none of them have ever understood why a man with the means to look flawless would choose otherwise. They have never had to sit in a frost meadow at midnight, Nell said, holding still while someone worked a barb loose one careful degree at a time, trusting a stranger's hands with the one part of themselves that could least afford a mistake. A scar like that is not a flaw, Majesty. It is a record. I would no sooner erase it than I would burn my father's trapline ledgers, and for exactly the same reason. Some things are worth keeping precisely because of what they cost to learn. Her father, mended fully by spring, and considerably more talkative about the whole affair than Nell would have preferred, took to telling anyone who would listen at the trading post that his daughter had spent a winter courting an emperor without once realizing it, and that he, for one, had suspected something the very night a dragon delivered her to a healer's door faster than any horse in the province could have managed. Nell endured the teasing the same way she endured most things, with the flat, patient practicality of a woman who had never much cared what the trading post thought of her business. The imperial menagerie keepers who came to learn her methods that first spring found her exacting and occasionally short-tempered with anyone who tried to rush a frightened animal's freeing, and reported back to the palace, with some bemusement, that the Empress had apparently decided patience was a discipline to be taught properly, or not taught at all. She trained 3 full seasons of keepers before she considered the vocabulary of patient freeing sufficiently passed on, and the Imperial Menagerie's injury records, in the decades that followed, showed a marked and well-documented improvement in recovery outcomes that the physicians attributed, somewhat sheepishly, to a trapper's daughter's stubborn insistence that healing could not be hurried past what the wound itself was willing to allow. Out of suffering have emerged the strongest souls. Nell Corrigan had spent 2 hard winters learning that patience was the only currency that mattered when something trapped and frightened needed freeing. It took a poacher's cruel Thornwood barbs, 3 careful extractions, and 1 whole winter of evening flights home to teach her that the same patient currency, spent on the right creature at the right pace, could also, in time, free something considerably larger than a wounded paw, an emperor who had forgotten, across 14 years of calculated court kindness, what it felt like to be helped by someone who wanted absolutely nothing back.